These are Chinese electric cars, many of them from a brand called BYD. They're either abandoned in fields after meeting sales numbers and discarded, or they blow up in flames as we're seeing now in these videos. Even as these bizarre things are taking place in China, it seems like the CCP is planning on using BYD as the cheap and poorly made EVs to try to dominate the world of exports from China. Welcome to China Insider. Today we're going to discuss how the company of BYD and their poorly made electric vehicles is actually flooding the market, much like how Huawei and other Chinese companies like Temu are doing so with different sorts of exports. So let's get into it. All right, now as you can see, the car itself, right, it looks beautiful in pictures, but that's pretty much it. Because within the core of it, it's much like Huawei, right? It's a state-backed company, so they receive a lot of support from the Chinese Communist Party to carry out a multiple purpose campaign to expand the influence. Because these companies, Huawei or BYD, by extension, they're basically carrying the identity of the Chinese Communist Party. So for them to win, it means it's also a win for the CCP. They're much cheaper than Teslas, right? It's basically the next weapon of export. Temu, you sell a lot of small things. This sells the big stuff. Now, one of the problem with BYD is actually about tariffs, because now if you're from China, you're importing the car, let's say into the United States, right? You have to pay tariffs. Now, the tariffs that you pay for an import from China is 25%. And then there's also a 2.5% on top of just in general the imported cars. But then what BYD is doing now is they're setting up shop in Mexico and also in Hungary in Europe, so that it becomes a domestically made or domestic production from Mexico rather than China. So it's not made in China. But the problem is, right, because Mexico is part of the USMCA, which is US, Mexico, Canada, where they have the free trade agreement, you only pay the 2.5%. So if the car is made in Mexico, it's technically it's not even an import anymore, right? So it's almost domestic. And that's why, a lot of American cars are also made in Mexico, but that's how they circumvent the tariffs for Chinese cars. Now, why is BYD a problem? Okay, so this is from the EU, right? This is from the Financial Times. It says BYD rejects EU claims subsidy help reduce price of China-made cars. Now, if you don't know, BYD is much cheaper than the likes of Teslas, and it beats out a lot of the domestic car makers. In Europe, you have Renault, you have all these different car makers, right? Audi, Volkswagen, they're all doing EV cars. In the US, you have Tesla, you have other makers like Chevy, Ford. They're all doing, like the Ford Lightning, right? F-150 Lightning. So the problem is BYD, they don't admit to state-backed support. BYD has rejected the EU accusations that success of Chinese car companies stem from state aid, as Brussels forges ahead with a probe into whether local subsidies were helping electric cars made in China undercut European-made models. Now, if you know anything about how Huawei works or any of the Chinese company work, is that the CCP is literally giving them money for them to drive down the prices to the point where domestic competition, you just simply can't beat it, right? That's how Huawei was winning contracts for like 3G, 4G left and right around the world, because their stuff is just so much cheaper. The governments had to use them because the alternatives, the domestic companies, they're asking double the price, triple the price, right? Whereas Huawei, for example, they were able to do it for fractions of the price. So they were essentially losing money trying to get into the system. And that's what BYD is also doing. Now, what's the problem with Chinese EVs? Well, one of them is it's a national security issue. You essentially have a spying device on you, right? It can record audio, videos, it can listen to you, it can send information to China, it can send your data, road data, where you've been, your map information, if you're conducting any sort of exchange of emails, phone calls, etc., right? But it's just poor quality. So there's a personal safety issue as well. These cars go up in flames. And so, do you really want to be in one of these things? But then also there's the CCP nationalism aspect, because these companies, they're imbued into the identity, right? So by extension, buying it's like you're buying into the CCP propaganda. They're basically launching a cognitive, psychological, and a mental warfare on the rest of the world. Look at China, their EVs, they're dominating. Right? When you're dealing with a Chinese company, you're not just dealing with a company, you're dealing with the CCP. And that's why, companies like Huawei or BYD, they're so desperate into trying to dominate not just the sales number. Obviously, they're selling a lot because they're cheaper, but they want to dominate the narratives, saying that China is making the best EVs around the world. And obviously that's where things are headed, right? So BYD pretends to be like the Tesla killer. That's what China wants. But in reality, the plan is a little bit more sinister because it's the ambitious goal of the Chinese Communist Party dominating EV trade around the world. And they want to replace the United States, right? But the problem with that is they're doing so by driving out domestic competition. So if, let's say, BYD was introduced into the US, because they're so much cheaper, people tend to buy cheaper things, right? I mean, if your propaganda says the car, outperforms Tesla by this much, it can battery last longer, like 100 plus miles, it takes less time to charge. Obviously, you think that's the better thing, so you're going to buy that, right? Most people don't care about the risks associated with this. They just simply see the upside. And that's the problem, because at that point, your domestic car makers, they're not going to make any money, right? They're going to be driven out of business. Traditional car makers too, and that's really the problem. Now, in reality, BYD has received billions and billions of dollars from state-backed support because, like I said, the founder of BYD, he used to hold like Communist Party official titles in the past. He's since given up on it because he's so rich now, but it doesn't mean he has no ties to the CCP. In China, right? You have to be tied to the government and the party to do things. And if your company is doing things on such a large scale, it's bound to be involving the CCP, right? And it's beneficial for the party to do this. So, as well as I think there was a director in BYD, and his name is Wang Zedong. He serves as the so-called independent non-executive director of BYD, but in reality, he's also working at something called a Norinco Group, which is actually a state-owned defense conglomerate. So the story here goes, the CCP once again using cheap goods, cheap labor, poor quality stuff to try to flood the market. Much like, the story we did on Temu, right? So I'll link that here if you haven't to check it out. Okay, it's the exact same playbook. You see the competition's being driven out, prices so low, higher sale number, right? So you can kind of tout how, oh my God, look at BYD, they're selling so much, right? And this is really the story of how China is planning to dominate their trade patterns, right, around the world. This is a story, again, from the Financial Times called China's Plan to Reshape World Trade on Its Own Terms. And they basically try to carve out this alternative version of focusing on not the free world, right, the first world countries, but focus on countries around China, the third world countries, or what they're calling it the global south right now. And that's where China is exporting a lot of this too. And that's where you're seeing EVs from China being sold the most, right? And before we continue, I just want to introduce for my sponsor segment today with my longtime partnership with Blueberry Creative. And this is one of the products which I really recommend. It's a red ginseng extract. Now it's called Kim's 6 years high purity red ginseng extract. You get 30 sticks, 10 mil, and you take one of these every day. Now, red ginseng, it's a Korean product. It's widely used because ginseng is really good for boosting immunity. It's good. It's anti-cancer, anti-carcinogenic stuff, as well as it's just boosting your overall mental awareness. Now, for me, I take this because I'm constantly reading stuff and coming up with new ideas and topics for my videos. So it's very helpful for me to recover my sort of mental awareness. And just after a long day of writing, editing, and shooting the video, it's a good recovery process. So I feel like after taking this, I do it in the morning, I get more energy throughout the day and I'm more awake. Because sometimes when you don't sleep much, you feel like, oh, it's not the day, But after you take one of these, you instantly feel like it's recovered. Like from internally, you feel better. So definitely recommend check it out if you're looking for a gift for your family or somebody that you think this will benefit from. Definitely check out Blueberry Creative. I'll leave the description and the link in the link in the description for the item and the link directly to come here to get it, as well as any products on Blueberry Creative. Use my code DAVID for 15% off. Now, if you're in the US, $70 or more, you can get free shipping. So check it out. Link will be in the description. But fortunately, though, the United States is noticing this. This is from Biden today. Says that it's addressing the national security risks with the U.S. auto industry. Specifically, he talks about two important points. The first one is China is determined to dominate the future of the auto market, including by using unfair practices, which we just talked about. China's policies could flood our market with its vehicles, posing risks to our national security. Now, I'm not going to let that happen on my watch. Props for Biden for doing this, by the way. The second point is China imposes restrictions on American autos and other foreign autos operating in China. Why would connected vehicles from China be allowed to operate in our country without safeguards? So that's a very important issue, right? Because anytime you use anything that's made in China, you run into the risks that I've just talked about. And then Senator Josh Hawley, who also introduced this today, which is to say that basically to raise the tariffs on any Chinese companies, regardless, if they're making it in Mexico or on the moon or, anywhere around, they're making it on Mars, it's still subjected to the same amount of tariffs as if it were made in China. So that's a really good thing, because by circumventing it, by making it in Mexico, you skip the 25%. And then that means you're essentially benefiting more by producing in Mexico, right? And then you're actually dragging Mexico closer to China, which is probably not a good idea too. Okay, so next we're going to talk about, let's see here, what China is basically doing, right? China is, Xi Jinping has basically carved out this plan to say that we're going to dominate the new Cold War by driving out the tech competition against the United States. So all these companies in China, you better focus on what I want. Now, it used to be chips, like semiconductors, right? So everybody's and their dads had like a semiconductor company. Like these meat facilities were also doing semiconductors. Clearly, a lot of them were just in it for the money. But now everybody's flooding to go down and make a EV company. So there's plenty of EV startups in China. The city of Shenzhen, which is where BYD is housed in, like their hometown, is also an export hub, right, in southern China. They're basically going to expand this, right? And so you're almost like you're going up against the entire country when you go up to compete against companies like BYD or, Temu or TikTok or Huawei, right? Okay, so the problem is if we don't do anything here in the United States, companies like Tesla, which they're operating in China, they're going to face more scrutinies. They're restricted in some areas where they can't travel in. They get disadvantaged preferential treatment compared to the domestic makers. And so this is like an overall sort of new Cold War stuff, right? Like China is obviously they want to, since the Trump trade war started, they want to have an alternative version of the trade sphere of influence in which they can no longer be bound by U.S. sanctions because those other countries who can freely trade with China can fulfill its needs for exports, and they no longer is, it's going to care about the sanctions from the United States. But that's still a long way to go. But at the same time, if the US and EU doesn't stop this from flooding their own market, then they run into the risk of essentially thousands, if not millions of jobs actually leaving this industry to go to China because, this is where the next big thing will be. But then also I want to talk a little bit about the future of electric vehicles, right? You might have heard that Apple is rumored to have abandoned the plan to make an electric car. But I don't know much about where this is trending. Personally, I think EVs are not as good as traditional cars. But in China, they're full force trying to become the best in it. I'm wondering if this is, because the problem with EVs is because most of the sources for batteries and their material actually is made in China. Tesla's batteries are made in China. And so you're almost like you're not starting on the right foot because everything is already made there. And then now they're focusing it so much on it that it feels like other other automakers like Audi or Volkswagen, or in the US you have the domestic ones, maybe they should focus on traditional cars again, given the fact that, I just feel like EV is not the way to go. But that's just my personal opinion. But again, a lot of times, like the technology that Chinese automakers have is actually stolen anyways. So if people move on to different things, maybe this whole thing with BYD would just kind of end itself. Who knows?